goats, so that we wanted to get them out to look at them. So we started shaking the pole. Well, the thing began to rock back and forth. The birds took flight, and the whole thing fell off and crashed. We destroyed the birdhouse. A baby bird fell and was running around, and in all the confusion, I hit the bird and killed the bird. Well, I felt bad. I felt real bad. We had basically vandalizing our neighbor's yard. And when Mom asked me about it, said, Mr. King said, the birdhouse got knocked down. Do you know anything about that? What did I say?
No.
I don't know anything about that. So I lied. And so that also began part of my descent into crime. My life of crime. Garrison Keillor, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about sin today. And I want you to say this Bible verse after me. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Will you say that?
For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Our young people are learning verses. In fact, they've learned 7 verses already that are from the New Testament, from the letter of Paul in the Romans Road, and we're going to be learning those. Last week's lesson was I am not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Remember that one? All right, say it if you remember. No, just kidding. Okay. Garrison Keillor, in one of his stories, he talked about a man who didn't go to church because, as he put it, I already know how to be better than I am. Don't we all know how to be better than we are? And what prevents us? Now, every religion is based on the assumption that something is wrong with us. We experience life on this earth, but a little voice cries out in our hearts that something is amiss, because as we observe all around us, there's hatred, there's crime, there's war, there's selfishness in big and little matters, there's masses living in poverty while others revel in unbelievable abundance. And then we look at the inner cities, and we see deteriorating inner cities with gangs and terrorism. We find in schools bullying. We know that so many people are affected by various forms of addiction. Murder is just rampant in many of our cities. Rape, sex trafficking, robbery. We could give a list that reveals that human existence is marked by violence and fear. Perpetrators and victims all need the rule of law, because we need to curb our aggressions. We don't all just get along because something is fundamentally wrong. And the religious dimension of life addresses that wrongness and offers reasons and proposes cures to cope with the situation and to offer some kind of hope and reason for humanity. Christianity also offers an analysis of the human condition, and it offers a solution. Take out your bullet in your bulletin, you'll find the sermon outline if you want to follow along as we're going on, because it's kind of a teaching sermon. Because I'm going to speak today about the Christian contribution to the field of thought about what's wrong with us. Christians call this state of distorted, it's something we live, we're born, we live as natural beings, but we don't live very well. And we call that distortion sin. That's a theological term, often misunderstood, and its meaning is often distorted. But I hope that we'll move a little bit in our understanding as we explore this concept today. There was an American from German heritage named Reinhold Niebuhr. He ended up teaching for a while at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He said that Christianity has bequeathed to the world 2 fundamental truths about human nature. Now listen to these, because these are things that we talk about almost every week in some way. A, we are made in the image of God, and therefore every human being is of infinite worth. We are capable, made in the image of God, capable of doing some of the most wonderful and noble things. And when people do acts of great self-sacrifice and kindness and concern for the poor, it's because they're made in the image of God. And it resonates, even if they're not a believer, it resonates with us. We are made in the image of God and of infinite worth, capable of wonderful things. But there's a corollary truth that Christianity has also emphasized. we are also sinners. Every one of us, no perfect people, capable of doing some of the most heinous and horrible things. Humans are of infinite worth because we're related uniquely to God. We're responsive and we are responsible to God. We're able to respond to God. And we naturally respond to love because whether believer or unbeliever, we are still made in that image of God, who is love. But the second great truth indicates that we're also sinners, flawed, capable of living so alienated from the image of God that humans behave often in cruel and inhuman ways. I could have told my mom, I broke it, I'm sorry. But fear and shame and guilt. The Holocaust that we celebrated so many years, not celebrated, commemorated. The killing fields of Cambodia, war, concentration camps, torture chambers, inquisitions, and genocide witness to the potential for cruelty that humans will inflict on other humans. And Christians call this condition sin. So, what is sin? Well, let me say a couple of things that sin is not. Let's clear the land before we build on it. Sin is not mere ignorance. That is, it isn't the fact that we don't know better. People often do things that they're very sure are wrong. Sin cannot be overcome by education. We can improve a lot of things by knowledge. Certainly the increase of human knowledge have cured many diseases, have been eradicated by understanding germs and the way human body works. Safety devices have made workplaces much safer, but this does not eliminate the inward impulse to do harm or evil that resides in the human heart. The most technologically, scientifically advanced, and intellectually advanced nations in Europe descended into the wholesale slaughter during World War I and World War II, with trench warfare, mustard gas, concentration camps, death marches, nuclear bombs even. Philosophically educated people have held slaves and practiced genocide against native people who lack the same sophisticated weaponry. Sin is not just ignorance that can be overcome by more education or technological advancement. It's actually given tools in the hands of evil to do even more harm. Some Christians have thought that sin was defined by pleasure. They're suspicious of pleasure. Sometimes Christians have unfortunately misunderstood sin and attribute it to the fact of pleasure and wrongly believe that God is a kind of heavenly cop watching over the world and finding out if anybody's enjoying themselves and then trying to come put a stop to that. Now, Christians are right to be suspicious of pleasure when we elevate the pursuit of pleasure to our number one concern. But God is the one who gave us the capacity to experience pleasure, and God seeks to help us regulate it so we do not destroy ourselves and others by giving pleasure our ultimate loyalty. Pleasure itself is a gift from God to be enjoyed with gratitude, but not to be used at other people's expenses. And here's another misunderstanding of sin, that sin is simply breaking a rule. Some people think that God is a lawgiver who made arbitrary rules that we must keep, breaking them to our own peril. Sin then is just simply breaking the rule. This line of reasoning really misses the point of any and all rules from God, that sin is not simply violating a code. The law, the rules, the maxims, the principles help to guide human behavior. They contain collective wisdom gained over the centuries. But the mere breaking of a rule is not in itself sin. Rules, laws, precepts, all of that can be helpful guides to human behavior, and we need it. Certainly children and young people begin to learn right and wrong with the use of rules. You can do this, you cannot do that. But rules do not exhaust the meaning of the Christian concept of sin. So, if those three things are just partial and a little bit deceptive, what is sin? First of all, I'd say it is a state of being. Sin, before it is ever an act of me shaking Mr. King's birdhouse. It's a condition that keeps us from being what God made us to be. It's a state of being. We are made to love God with all of our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our strength. And we are made to love our neighbor as ourselves. Things go along splendidly if we could all do that. But the state of the condition of sin that prevents us from doing so, that is what we're talking about. We are estranged from our essential being. A rat lives like a rat. A pig lives like a pig. A horse lives like a horse. A human being will live in inhuman ways. We're the only creature that really doesn't live out our destiny. I know how to do better, but I don't do it. The Greek word for sin is an interesting word because it's hamartia. It means to miss the mark. I failed and find myself captive to habits and patterns and attitudes and dispositions that are unloving and that resist God's goodness. The word for that in the New Testament is hamartia. It's drawn from the image of archery. The archer shoots for the bullseye but misses the target. The Bible describes the human condition this way in that little compact and portable verse, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Hamartia. We have missed the mark. The glory of God is what we mean by the image of God in humanity. I am made in the glory and image of God, and yet I don't live that way. Before sin is an act, it is a fact. It's a state of estrangement. It is universal. For all have sinned. There are no perfect people here. Look around you in this room. There's no one who has gotten it all right and has never sinned. We are all sinners. And the church is not a club of the gathering of the holy. It is a hospital for sinners. Let's nurture this concept just a little bit. And add that when this state of estrangement, I'm not really who God made me to be. I need to be restored in some way. Or those attitudes and actions which are destructive of community. What I'm saying is, the estrangement is not benign. It actually causes me, urges me, compels me to do things that are destructive of myself and destructive of the community around me. A gossiping tongue really doesn't help people, does it? What are the effects of sin? When we sin, and we learn this from the story in our series about Adam and Eve in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, is that guilt and confusion and distorted relationships occur. To claim that we're sinners does not mean that each one of us is as bad as we can be. I think most of us are pretty nice people. I'm trying to be a good person. Most people are sinners, and yet they restrain their sinful activities. We filter them. When Christians say that we are all sinners, we do not mean that we are all solid mud, but we do mean that there's no part of human life that remains untainted. We are waters that have been impurified. In fact, in the crucifixion of Jesus, Christ reveals that even the religious dimension of life is tainted with sin, and how many evils and heinous things have been done in the name of religion. We can't say that religion is the answer. Even religion is not exempt from the stain of sin. And what are the effects of sin? Broken relationships with God that issues in acts that manifest our brokenness. Sin distorts our lives, and sin occasions guilt in our conscience when it becomes activated. That's what happened to me as a child. I remember that when I confronted the truth, I had torn it down, and my mother asked me about it. I lied. And then I felt guilt like a 5-pound weight. You can do enough of those lies and you won't feel that guilt anymore. You'll still be guilty, but you won't feel it. In fact, many people who do wrong things don't feel any guilt. Another effect is shame. Shame that makes us feel somehow incomplete. I want somebody to come and tell you a story about deliverance from that, because the whole gospel, that I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're not a community of people that can look down on anyone. We're a community of people, of broken people, who have come together to be healed, and that's what salvation means. Susan, will you come and share with us? You're so taken up my story you didn't remember. You're the one that's supposed to get it.
Yeah, but you didn't print the warning label. I cried. At hymns, pictures, sneezes, grace. Oh, I can never say grace. I'm Susan. So good morning. I feel God calls me to do more. Today is one of those days, so I'm going to try. 46 years ago, my relationship with God, my church, all came to a grinding halt. I was raised in the Catholic faith, and I found love, acceptance, peace, and lots of joy. In my younger years, I fell in love, and I became pregnant. Naturally, I went to my priest to marry me, but he refused. He would, however, baptize my child. I was crushed and I was confused, and looking at him, he explained, the innocent child was not responsible for the sins of the mother. The power of those words, the sins of the mother, left me in tears. So I'm going to burn in hell, but my child can be saved. My interpretation, not the priests, not the church, no other laws, just my interpretation. There were many more misconceptions throughout my life. I named it my Catholic guilt. I returned to that parish to bury my father, but never to worship again. I married the man I loved. I had 2 more children, and life was okay until it wasn't. He developed a drinking problem and was abusive. My marriage failed. So you get what you get, and you don't get upset. Sorry, guys. I broke the rules. I was responsible for anything bad that happened in our lives. So time went on, and I was able to reconcile a lot of things in my heart, but not so much in my mind. I anguished over a spiritual death sentence for a long time. I could feel God, but he was always so far away. I began attending the church here, and I found acceptance and love and joy and even some peace. Still, the Catholic guilt tugged at me. So a few weeks ago, it came up again during a conversation over lunch, Steph and Kim. And I was told to leave it at the cross. Just matter of factly. The power of those words lifted a weight off of my heart. Could it be that simple? Never once did it occur to me to give that to God. But what was I giving him? The answer came again from Steph while we were preparing for Soup Sunday. Shame. Not Catholic guilt, but shame. A few sleepless nights and some counsel from Pastor Kim and Steph, I was able to name it and claim it, and I gave it to God. So God was never far away. I was. But I'm home now, and all is well.
The Son sets free is free indeed. Sin is real, but the good news is that we can claim it, own it, and leave it at the cross. The whole gospel that Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. Since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Yet that's why we're here, is to preach good news. That shame, guilt, a past that we have messed up, the patterns of our lives that have been deforming can all be brought to the cross. And Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. We can join with the praise band. I think we've said enough today.
We're going to sing together, and we'll stand as our closing song, the song that we sang during the offering. And in light, we're singing it in celebration of what God has done for Susan and what God wants to do with each of us, to remember that God has welcomed us. We are his child.